One of the most valuable pieces of advice I've received when beginning my journey in the IT career field was how important it was to build systems from scratch as a way to learn rather than simply maintain systems that are already in place. So we can think about learning by building from scratch as learning to bake a blueberry pie by starting with the raw ingredients. Understanding how the ingredients work together to produce a tasty blueberry pie will make you a better baker rather than simply following a recipe. So when a customer orders a blueberry pie, you could follow the recipe and you could bake it to perfection and you could deliver it on time to the customer. But what if something goes wrong or the customer wants to make it a blueberry cheesecake pie? If you understand the building blocks of the pie and why you use a certain amount of flour and sugar and butter, etc., you can troubleshoot issues and adapt to new demands much easier than trying to Google every new issue that arises. In this course, you'll learn to build an Active Directory domain from scratch on Windows Server. Along the way, you'll learn the key concepts of Active Directory, including user and group management, organizational units, and group policy. We'll also cover essential network services like the domain name system. And when you're finished with this course, you'll have the skills and knowledge to administer Active Directory and learn some best practices needed to further your skills as a Windows system administrator. Active Directory is a service that organizes and manages users, groups, and policies on a network. It is how administration is performed in a Windows environment and a key ingredient for our understanding in the pie baking process. Active Directory is used everywhere in today's business networks, and companies will always have a need for people who can administer it. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the most valuable resources someone can use who's just starting out in IT is create a home IT lab. But you might be thinking, what exactly is a home lab? Some people go all out with racks of servers humming away in their basement. Others just start with a simple few virtual machines running on an old laptop or in the cloud. The key question isn't what equipment that you need, but it's figuring out what you want to learn. What is virtualization? Benefits of using virtual machines. Let me share some great news with you. I'm going to do my best to point you towards open source tools that'll keep your home lab set up as wallet friendly as possible. And that brings us to one of the most important concepts you'll need to understand: virtualization. If you're already comfortable with virtualization, you're golden, you can probably skip ahead. But if it's still a little fuzzy, let me paint a picture of how we got here. Picture this. Back in the day, every time a business needed to run a service or an application, they had to buy a whole separate physical server just for that one thing. So if a company wanted to run their website, they'd need one server for their web content, another server for their database, and yet another server just to store the individual website files. This worked fine when the internet was smaller and businesses were simpler, but as things exploded online, companies suddenly needed way more servers. Instead of just one web server, they might need 10. And that could mean 10 more database servers and 10 more file servers. And each one was only using a fraction of its actual computing power. It was like buying a whole restaurant kitchen just to make one sandwich. Incredibly wasteful and definitely not sustainable. Virtualization takes all of the physical components of a server and it creates an abstract layer called a hypervisor that takes all of the building blocks, the processing power, the memory, the storage, and security features of a server, and divides them up to create virtual machines. Remember our blueberry pie analogy? Let's use it again. Now, several customers walk into your restaurant. Each of them want a blueberry pie. You could bake a whole new pie for each person, but that's pretty wasteful and way too much food for one person. So instead, you slice up your pie into individual servings. Each slice still has all of these essential components: blueberries, whipped cream, and crust. But it's the right size for that one person. That's exactly how virtualization works. Your physical server is the whole pie, and each virtual machine is a slice that gets its fair share of computing power, being maybe the blueberries, its memory, which could be the whipped cream, and storage, which is the crust. They work just like real computers. But just like you can't slice a pie indefinitely, you can't create unlimited virtual machines either. Eventually, you'll run out of computing resources to go around. So there are two main types of hypervisors, and thankfully, they kept the naming convention pretty simple. Type 1 and Type 2. Type 1 is your heavy hitters. They're called the bare metal hypervisor. This is because they run directly as the operating system on the physical server, grabbing every bit of available computing power. You'll find this mostly in big businesses where performance is really everything. Type 2 hypervisors run as applications on top of existing operating systems like Windows 11 or Mac OS. There's a bit more overhead here since the hypervisor has to share its resources with your current operating system, but they're perfect for home labs and learning environments. For what we're building, we're going to use a Type 2 hypervisor as it's more practical for home use and much easier to get started with. Alright, so there are some prerequisites that we have to make sure that we take care of before proceeding in this video. The first is just to make sure that your PC or laptop that you're using has the minimum specs on the screen here. And if you're wondering if your CPU has virtualization support, usually that is a setting that you can check for in the BIOS. For VMware Workstation Pro, that is a free product as of now. However, it does require that you set up a Broadcom login first. For Windows Server 2019 and the Windows 10 ISOs, those can just be downloaded following the links on the screen as well. And you do not need a login for those. We are now going to set up our home lab environment, and we are going to start by installing and configuring VMware Workstation Pro. We are going to create our first virtual machine. We are going to go through the initial server configuration process. We are going to install VMware tools. And at the end, we will take a snapshot that we can revert back to if needed. Alright, so we are at VMware Workstation Pro 17. I would assume that everybody's been able to download the appropriate ISOs needed for this lab, and obviously downloaded and installed VMware Workstation Pro 17. So if everybody's at that point, I can show you how to set up your first virtual machine. So when we're ready, let's go to File, New Virtual Machine. And we'll follow the wizard here, and we're going to choose Custom. That way we can go through every step in the process. Click Next. Leave the defaults here. Click Next. And normally we would choose the ISO here, but we're going to choose I will install the operation system later. I'll tell you why in a second. But let's keep it as is here and click Next. Alright, we're going to specify what kind of OS it is, and it's going to be our first one anyways is going to be Microsoft Windows. It is going to be server version 2019. Click Next, and we're going to name it, and we're going to name this DC01, and this is going to be our domain controller, and we will get into what that means and what that's all about later on. But for now, that's what we can name it. You can place it in any location that you want on your computer, and click Next. Firmware type, it's going to default to UEFI, which is what we want for, especially any of these newer operating systems. We don't need secure boot. So let's just click Next here, and we're going to have to specify the number of virtual processors, and we can get into more virtualization concepts along the way too, but we're going to go with 4. Actually, we're going to change this to 4, change this to 1. That way, this might be confusing, but we actually just want one CPU, basically one virtual CPU with 4 cores on it, and this will give us our total number of cores on that CPU. So So click next here. So for us, if you can do it, 4 gigs is going to be what we can go with for our first domain controller. As far as the network type, we are going to leave the default network address translation, which is a whole concept in itself, but basically we are just sharing our host machine's network. Even if we use a different subnet from our virtual machines, we're going to share and translate from our physical machine's network. So we're going to leave this here, click next, and we can leave the recommended for our SCSI controller type for our virtual disk. Click next. Same with the virtual disk type. We're going to leave it as the recommended. Click next. And we are going to create a new virtual disk. And we don't need it too big. And in fact, 60 gigs is really what we want. And you can see here it's recommended anyways for server 2019. And what I would like to do, just because it's not going to be very big, I like to keep it as a single file. It'll make it easier to manage, plus it'll be a little bit faster, I think. And click next. Alright, it is just going to be one VMDK virtual disk, and if you want to keep it in the same place as your virtual machine files, you can just click next here and click finish. So that should pop right up. So once we're in here, we're going to go back to edit virtual machine settings, and now we'll select our virtual media. Now we'll go to the ISO file and we will specify that Windows Server 2019 ISO. Make sure that we have connected power on. Okay. If we did it in the beginning, the wizard would actually try to give us basically an easier way to install and assume that we have a certain setup. And when I did it that way, I noticed it only gave us the Server 19 core as the option, and that doesn't give us a graphical user interface. And of course, we want the graphical user interface. So just by doing it this way, it doesn't do any guesswork for us, and it'll just kind of give us the installer. So click OK here, and now we should be good to go. Do power on this virtual machine. Alright, press any key to boot from CD. And if you didn't catch it, if you didn't press any key in time, it's just gonna eventually bring you to a BIOS screen, and you can select the virtual CD, DVD media from there, and you'll come right back here. So don't worry about it too much if you didn't catch it. Okay, and this is pretty straightforward. Alright, we're going to click next here, install now. So even if you don't have a license key, right, we're just using it in evaluation mode anyways. It's not going to require you to put a license key in. It'll give you 180 days of trial, and I'll show you how, if you wanted to kind of re-up that in the future, there's a way that we can do it to extend the evaluation. So for us, the standard evaluation with desktop experience is fine. The desktop experience is going to give us that graphical user interface that I was talking about. So click next here, accept the license terms. There's no way we're going to read all that. Click next. Okay, and we don't really want to upgrade because we don't have anything to upgrade. This is a fresh install. So we're going to come down to advanced and do install Windows only. And as you can see, this is our unallocated 60 gig virtual hard disk that we set up earlier. And that's perfect. And we can just click next here. And it's going to take maybe 10 or 15 minutes. So now we're at this point, we are going to set a password for our default local administrator. So set whichever password you like. And click finish. We can do Control-Alt-Delete, because if you do it from your keyboard, you might lock your actual host machine. So we'll come up here and just hit this button to unlock the virtual machine. Type in the password for your local administrator. And now we are in the Windows Server OS environment. And for us, hit yes here. That way we can be discovered on our network. Yes, we know about Windows Admin Center. We're not going to use that right now, but you will see that Server Manager launches, which is exactly what we want. Before we start messing with Server Manager, just note here that we are in standard evaluation mode. It is a license for 180 days, like I mentioned earlier. And the time zone might be a little bit off for you. As you can see, it is a little off for me. So let's just make sure if we're going to deal with domain controllers and things of that nature, that we get the correct time zone. Put your time zone, obviously, don't put mine. Okay, so now we're good there. And okay, we did name our virtual machine DC01 from the VMware Workstation perspective, but we're still going to need to do it on our actual OS. So we'll just launch the File Explorer, come up here, right click, go to Properties. And as you can see, it's kind of given us a generic computer name to start with, and we want to change that. So let's change it to, again, DC01. That's great. We'll keep it as a work group for now. And it's telling us we must restart to apply the changes. That's fine. We will close out of here, and we're going to restart a little bit later just because we have one last thing to do before we restart. And that is going to be setting a static IP. So come here to Network down here at the bottom on the taskbar. Right click that, go to Open Network and Internet Settings. Change Adapter Options right here. Let's right click this. This is our virtual NIC. And we're going to go to Properties. Internet Protocol version 4. That's all we really care about. And we're going to set the following IP address. So this is going to be our IP scheme going forward. 192.168.3.3 subnet mask 255.255.255.0 default gateway 192.168.3.2 DNS. Since our DC is our DNS, we can use 192.168.3.3. And as an alternate, we can use a public DNS, Google's public DNS of 8.8.8.8. Click OK. And how did we get that network information? Well, if you come up to Edit and come down to Virtual Network Editor, you'll actually see that when we created a new virtual NIC using the network address translation type, it gave us a 192.168.3.0 subnet for us that we can use, and we can verify that down here with the subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. And if we click on NAT settings here, we can actually see the default gateway that it uses for communication. So any IP and any device that we have on our lab network will follow this IP scheme. Close that. Here, go ahead, go to Start, Power, and Restart. Alright, and we are planning to restart. That should not take too long. Alright, and it might take a little longer for you, not sure. But again, let's go back up here, hit this Control-Alt-Delete button for the virtual machine. Log back in, and actually we have one last thing to do, which I probably could have done it before the reboot, but I didn't, is install this package called VMware Tools. And basically, it's a set of basically drivers for the OS that it's just going to enhance performance, keyboard and mouse input, and graphic input for your virtual machine. Let's right click on DC01 and actually come down here to install VMware Tools. It's going to mount a ISO for us right here called VMware Tools, and we're going to launch that. All right, coming down here, and we're just going to follow the guide here, keeping it pretty standard all the way. So typical installation, go ahead, install the new packages and drivers for the OS. And this is going to be on every virtual machine that we spin up, whether it's Windows machine or a Linux machine. And as you can see, even right now, we get a little bit bigger window. And yes, we have to restart again. I suppose I could have added that in the first time, but I didn't. So now if we make the VM full screen, we should actually see it cover the full screen, whereas if we didn't have VMware Tools installed, it would have given us more of like a 4x3 smaller window. Alright, so at this point, before we start actually getting into Active Directory and setting up our domain controller, it's good to take what's called a snapshot. It's a frozen moment in time for the VM, so if you have to roll back to any changes that you've made, you can roll back to the snapshot. So best way for us is to actually shut the virtual machine down. So come in here, right click, come down to power, shut down guest, and we'll take a snapshot. So if you change any configurations or mess anything up from here on out, and you think, oh man, this didn't really work out how I wanted it to, you can always come back to our snapshot where we have a clean install. We haven't done anything yet besides install VMware Tools. So you're going to right click here, snapshot, take snapshot. And this can be, let's just call it baseline. So you can just do pre Active Directory Services. Alright, take snapshot. We have our snapshot, so now anything that we do from here on out are changes, and we can roll back if needed. What are domains, domain controllers, and forests? Alright, well, a domain is a grouping of resources such as users and computers within an organization. We can think of a domain as a bakery that contains bakers, waitstaff, and customers. A domain controller is a dedicated server within that domain that runs the Active Directory service to administer and control those resources. We can think of a domain controller as the bakery manager. A forest in Active Directory is a grouping of domains that build trust between each other to share resources. We can think of a forest as the bakery owner who owns multiple bakeries throughout the city. So a forest can have just one domain in it as well, similar to as if the bakery owner owned just one bakery in the city. Single domain versus multi-domain forests. Alright, well, in a single domain forest, you can have just one domain. We can call it the master domain, but it can be managed by multiple domain controllers working together as a team. These domain controllers are essentially synchronized copies of each other, all sharing the same underlying schema and directory information. A multi-domain forest, on the other hand, you might have separate domains for separate departments, geographical locations, or business units. For example, a business might have domains like, let's just say for our sake, mylabdomain.com, and mylabdomain2.com, and mylabdomain3.com. Each domain maintains its own users, groups, and organizational units. What makes this setup powerful, though, is there's an automatic trust relationship that forms between domains within the same forest. Trusts act like agreements between friendly nations, for instance, and they allow domains to share resources and information with each other while maintaining their individual identity. The forest root domain. If you've worked with computers for any length of time, you've probably encountered the term root before, whether it's the root directory of a file system or the root user account with administrative privileges. Root generally refers to the top level of something. Active Directory follows the same concept with the forest root domain. When you create your very first domain in an Active Directory forest, that domain automatically becomes the forest root domain. The forest root domain isn't just another domain that happens to be created first. It actually gets a unique set of privileges for managing forest-wide operations. Most importantly, it controls the addition and removal of other domains within the forest. So you want to add a new domain to your office? Okay, that request goes through the forest root domain. You need to decommission a domain after, there's a corporate restructure. Again, the forest root domain handles that operation. Domain functional levels and forest functional levels. We won't be spending a ton of time on this section, but just for your awareness, when you upgrade your Windows Server OS that hosts your Active Directory domain, the new OS has new features that integrate and that could improve support or improve security, which would involve raising the functional level of the domain, basically just to give you more access to those features. All right, so back at our VMware workstation, let's power on our DC01 so we can get started in this portion of the lab, which is going to be installing the Active Directory domain services and promoting our server to our domain controller. And because we are creating our very first domain in an Active Directory forest, this domain controller will be our forest root domain. All right, so let's get logged in here. Go back up, Control-Alt-Delete, log in with your set password. All right, and we're coming in. Server Manager is going to launch automatically, which is fine. That is what we want. So when you come in here, the first thing we're going to do is come up to Manage, come to Add Roles and Features, and this is going to be the wizard that takes us through the installation process. So let's click Next here, and actually I will make this full screen. That way we have a little bit more room to work with here. Okay, and the installation type, we're going to leave it as role-based because we are going to install the role associated with Active Directory services. DC01 is the only one in the pool, so let's click Next there. And we're going to want Active Directory domain services. And it's going to tell you these are the subsequent roles and features that come along with it, and that is great. That's what we want. So add features here. And we will go over DNS in a little bit, but we are going to make this our DNS server as well. So click that, add features here. So you should have a check mark here and a check mark here. Active Directory domain services and DNS server. Click Next. And this is just additional features, which we are not going to do any more additional features here. So just click Next and Next again here. And once again, Next at DNS server. And now it's going to just give us a summary of what we're about to do. And let's leave this unchecked for now, and let's just watch the install process. All right, so it has completed, and we see here additional steps are required to make this machine a domain controller. And we also get a little warning up here, and that warning is it's actually telling us exactly what we have to do next. And this is what we want to do. So let's click promote this server to a domain controller. And we have some deployment types here. Well, this is going to be not a domain controller in an existing domain because we don't have an existing domain. We don't have an existing forest, right? This is kind of the first creation of anything that we're doing. So we're gonna add a new forest. And as you can see, it's gonna bring us, since this is our first one, it's gonna bring us to the root domain name here, and we can name it as we like. So for the sake of this lab, we're gonna do mylab.com and click next. And for domain controller options, we can leave the forest and domain functional levels as is, and basically just set our password here if we are going to end up needing to do any kind of directory service restores in the event of a disaster recovery situation. So set your password here, and we can kind of go over this process later on. Click next here and click next again. All right, and click next again here. All right, and these are default locations for Active Directory database log files and sysvol. So all of the configuration that is needed to host the Active Directory services, because again, Active Directory is a database. We will leave these as default for our lab purposes and click next. Next again, and it's going to go through some prerequisite checks and validate that everything has been installed and meets all of the requirements needed to be promoted to a domain controller. Even if you get some warnings here, as long as you don't get any red X's, that's really all I'm worried about at this point. So if your screen looks like mine, you should be ready to go. So let's do an install, and after this completes, we will do a complete reboot, and we will actually have our new domain called mylab.com, and we can start moving forward with adding some elements into our lab. All right, so let's get logged back in here, and I can go over verifying DNS settings on our new domain controller. So as you can see now, when you log in, you have this mylab / administrator. This indicates that we are actually on our domain, and even though this is the administrator account, it is not our local admin account that we have been using, but this is the built-in administrator account on the domain. So let's get logged back in here. Alright, so now that we're logged in, let's verify that DNS is in fact installed. So come down to Start, do a search for DNS. Let's go over the types of records that we have for DNS. So let's click into mylab.com, and let's talk about A records. A records are for mapping names to IP addresses, and they're the most commonly used record in DNS. So as you can see right here under type, we have host A. So this is going to be our A record, our default A record for our domain controller. So we have DC01 that is mapped to the static IP that we set earlier, 192.168.0.1. And that is an IP version 4 IP address, which is why it is a record. If it was a IP version 6, you would have a what's called a quad A record, 4 A's. So let's talk about records. So let's right click here. If we did a new host record, it's going to ask us for either an A or a quad A, being IP version 4 or IP version 6. Go down here to other new records, and we can look at some other ones that we can choose from. So another common one you'll see here is CNAME. Really what that is mapping an alias name to a domain name. So common use for this would be, let's map www.mylab.com to just mylab.com. Or if you have Google, map the Google with 3 O's instead of 2. Maybe you map that to just google.com. That way, anybody goes to those other URLs, they get redirected to one centralized naming convention. I like to think of CNAME as change name. That way I know it's a change from one name to another. Other people like to think of it as just like a shortcut. We are going to focus mostly on A records in our lab, but I'll show you another one that is sometimes used, and that is service location, SRV records. That's typically if you're going to map services such as LDAP with a particular protocol such as TCP to a domain, you'd use the SRV record. And lastly, let me actually go back because I think I forgot one that's actually going to come into play a little bit later, and that is going to be pointer records. Right here, basically a pointer record is the opposite of host A record. So host A record, remember, maps your DNS name to an IP address. This is going to mapping your IP address to your domain name. It is essentially a reverse lookup zone. In Active Directory, we have users, groups, and organizational units. They work together to create a structured way to manage people and resources within the environment. Users are the individual accounts that represent actual people who need to access the network. Each user has their own login credentials and specific permissions based on what job they need to do. Groups are a collection of users that share similar access needs, and instead of assigning permissions to each individual user individually, you put them in groups and assign permissions to the group. So when someone leaves or joins the company, you can add or remove them from the group rather than manually adjusting their individual permissions. And there are different types of groups. There are security groups, which control access to the resources, while the distribution groups are mainly used for email lists, and we're going to focus mostly on security groups when we start in our lab. And organizational units. Organizational units are the containers that help organize your structure. They represent the actual structure of the organization. They manage your policies, and they can nest other OUs within them. And the way that they work together is you place your user accounts and groups into the appropriate OU based on where they fit in your organization. So an OU is a container, and it can house users, it can house groups, and it can house other OUs as well. So you can apply these policies and settings at the OU level that are automatically going to affect every single object inside that OU. For example, you might have different password policies for your IT department versus your sales team, and you would apply different settings to their respective OUs. Groups can contain users from different OUs, which is helpful because people from various departments might need to access the same resources. So these policies that you apply to these organizational units are called group policy objects, or GPOs, and we'll get into this in a little bit. But it lets you control things like desktop settings, right? Password policies, like we talked about, software installations, security configurations, and you can set all of those individualized policy on the group policy manager, and then you can apply those to a specific OU or multiple OU, and then every user or group within that OU would get those settings. And it makes this administration more efficient because you're working with logical groups rather than managing individuals on a user by user basis. Alright, let's exit out of our DNS manager and come down here to the start menu. Let's do a search for Active Directory, and you'll see it pop up right here. So here is our Active Directory. We don't have much going on yet, but let's start creating some objects. This is the domain right up here at the top, these cluster of servers here, and if you hit the drop down, you'll see some built-in folders and some built-in users and some built-in groups and one built-in OU, which you can tell by this little icon right here. So that administrator that you logged in with, that is a built-in account on the domain as a user, and we also have some of these built-in roles, which are our security groups. So let's start with right-clicking here, and we'll do new, and we'll do user, so we can start getting our test user on the domain. So Let's just create a name here for them. You can use whatever you like. And for logon username, I'm going to go first initial, last name. And there we go. This is also our UPN name. This is more for backwards compatibility. This is not used as frequently anymore. Let's click next here. And let's uncheck that they have to change their password. I'm actually going to make it so their password never expires because this is just a lab. Create a password here for your new user. Click next and finish. As easy as that. So we don't see the user here show up, and that's because everything in our domain that we create is automatically going to default back to the root of the domain here. So you'll see it, you'll see our user just kind of living outside of these folders here. All right, so next let's create a group. So we'll go down to new group here. And for this, let's just make this my lab administrators. And again, we're just going to stick with the security group. That way we can assign permissions, read, write, execute, what have you, here. So this is just as simple as just clicking OK. And again, it just defaults to being at the root of the domain. And let's do a right click again. Let's do a new group again. And this time we'll do my lab users. Same thing, just click OK. So now we have one user and a couple groups. That way, we can kind of split up what we want to do for permissions based on if they're an administrator on the network or if they're just a standard user. And you know what? Let's make one more user. That way we can compare what an administrator and what a user has for permissions. So let's do Alright, so same kind of conventional naming here. Click next, do the same thing. We'll make the password not expire, set the password here. So these are the passwords that your users are going to log in with. So if they ever need a password reset or things of that nature, you would come in here and you can set it, as well as some other places. All right, we'll come up here, we will right click, we will do new organizational unit. Okay, we will uncheck the protect container, that way we can delete it easier if we need to later on. And let's just create an OU called admins. All right, go up, do the same thing, right click, new organizational unit. Uncheck this, we'll create one called users. Or I'm sorry, I guess we cannot do users, but let's just do users OU. That should be okay. We'll do right click again, come to new, do organizational unit, same thing. We will do computers OU. All right. Same thing, right click, do new organizational unit, uncheck here, and we will do servers OU. Do OK. And let's see if we can change this admins one, just so we have some standardization here. Okay. So as you can see, we have 4 new folders. They have this new icon on them. These are our organizational units. So we can start placing objects into these organizational units, and then when we go into group policy, we will start to apply policies here, which will propagate down to any members in here. So let's go back to our domain root, and all we have to do is click and drag. So let's drag Bob Dylan here to our, let's have him be in our admins group. Admins OU, my mistake. Okay, we will have Jimi Hendrix. We will drag him down to our users OU. All right, he's going to be our user. And as far as the groups go, we'll just match what we just did. So the administrators group will sit in the admins OU, and the MyLab users will sit in the users OU. Okay, great. So we will come over here, and now we have Bob and the administrators group together. However, if we look inside the group here, there are no members. So we would have to come down to add, and this is where we can add users to a group. So you can just type in first name is okay. We can do check names, and that will auto-populate. Click OK and OK. So now if we click on Bob Dylan himself, we can see under the member of tab that he is by default given the domain users group, but he's also now given the MyLab administrator group. So we can come down here to users OU and do the same thing here. Right now in this group we have no members, so we will come to add, and this time we will add Jimmy. So check names, that auto-populates. Click OK and OK again. We can verify him by going up to member of. We see the same thing. Great. So we are good here. Now, if we a Windows machine on our domain and see about testing our logins with our new users. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can exit out of the full screen mode, come down here to File, New Virtual Machine, and we will go through again the custom option here. We'll go next. We will keep this the same and click next. Now we're going to choose I will install an operating system later. That way we don't have any of that guesswork. We can do it ourselves. So it is going to be a Windows machine. It's going to be in our case we have a Windows 10 ISO. Click next, and let's name this Win 10-A. A as in it's going to be the first Windows machine, virtual machine on our network here. So we can leave it in the default location. That's okay. We can click next. And I believe this is still going to be UEFI. And we can leave secure boot unchecked. That is all right. And again, we don't need to hog up our host machine here with too much, so we can just do one processor. If you can do it, let's just do 4 cores for now. Click next, and let's just give it 4 gigs, nothing too crazy. As you can see, my maximum is about 21 that I can do on my machine. Click next. We are still going to go with network address translation. Click next, next again, next again, and we will create a new disk. Again, this is going to be a single file, and I really want to try to conserve space, so I'm just going to leave it at 60. I could even go a little bit less if I wanted, but 60 is going to be okay for us, and that should be fine as well. Click next, and let's click finish. That should spin right up. Great. Now let's go ahead and go to edit virtual machine settings, and now we'll come down to the virtual media here. Now we will go select our ISO, and now we will go find our ISO wherever you have it. I happen to have mine on a file share. And I'm going to choose Win10. Okay. Not a problem. For me, power this on. Alright, and we're getting a loading screen here, and this is where we can just walk through the steps as you've seen previously. So let's click next here, and we will go with install. And we don't have to have a product key, so come down here and click I don't have a product key. And let's go with Windows 10 Pro. That's what we're going to go with in our lab. We accept the software license. We will continue. We will do custom and just assign it the full unallocated space. And it's going to go through its process. Okay, now that we are on this screen, let's go ahead and just click our way through here. Alright, when you get here, let's do setup for an organization. And click next. And here, let's come down to the bottom left. We want to join a domain instead. Let's just give ourselves, this is still going to just be a local account. So I'm just going to go with admin. That way, once we join this computer to the domain, we can still log in. If we ever get disconnected from the domain, we can still log in with our local user account. And for the security answers and questions, you can see that you can really just type anything in there. And click next. And I am not going to install any of this extra location tracking, diagnostics, advertising ID, all that stuff we can turn off. Less things that our Windows machine will have to load. We can skip all of these. Again, this is just our test Windows 10 machine, so we can have our users log in and test our policies and permissions that we're going to start assigning. So not now here. And go to this PC, and let's right click in the open space here. And again, we have kind of an arbitrary computer name. Let's go ahead and change that. And let's just do win10-a. And for right now, I know that we are going to join it to the domain, but I like to just keep it in the workgroup for a second. Let's click OK here. It is going to prompt us for a reboot, which is okay. But before we do that, so let's do restart later. Let's also just take care of a couple small things. One being the time difference. It's still off. So let's go ahead and just update that right now. Alright, and then you can see down here, VMware Workstation does remind us about installing VMware tools. So we can go ahead and do that by just clicking on it. And again, it'll mount itself. As you can see, it unmounted that Windows 10 ISO and now has mounted the VMware tools, which we can just go through the installer like you've already seen. Alright, now we can come up. Let's make this full screen now that we are able to. Alright, and let's get ourselves logged in. Right now we are still not on the domain, so we are just going to use our local admin password. Okay, this brings us back in, and now let's do that last missing piece. Come back to this PC, right click, properties, change settings over here, and now let's go ahead and join the domain. What domain is it? It is going to be mylab.com. Click OK. Oh, well, Why can't we join the domain? Well, for one thing we didn't do, change our IP address. We have a particular network that we are using. So let's go ahead, launch the network connections, come down here to properties, IP version 4, and let's set our own static IP address, 192.168.3.10. Give us some room. Subnet mask is a /24, so 255.255.255.0. Our default gateway, 192.168.3.2. Down here to DNS, that is going to be our domain controller, 192.168.3.3. And alternative, we can put a public DNS that should be okay as for fallback. We'll do Google's DNS, so 8.8.8.8, and okay, and close. Let's wait a second until we get our network. Yes, we want this to be discoverable, no problem. Okay, well, now since we have an IP on this network, I would think that if we go and click OK here again, look at that, now we get prompted to join the domain. So we need an account with credentials on the domain to allow us to join. So we are going to specify what our domain is. We'll do a \, and we'll say, well, we know we have our built-in administrator. I think that is our only account right now that actually has administrative privileges. We'll specify it, type in the password, click OK, and we get a little pop-up saying welcome to the lab. Alright, and it's going to prompt a reboot. Let's go ahead and do that reboot now. Okay, let's get back logged into our Windows 10-A, and this time, instead of using our local administrator, let's just go down to other user. And as you can see here, it does show the domain that we are going to be signing into right here, my lab. So let's use our first created user, Dylan, and password, and log in. And now Active Directory is logging us in to our domain. And since this is the first time we've logged in, it's going to be setting our profile up for us, which might take a minute or so. And here we are. We have successfully logged in with our first domain created user. Okay, so now we have communication, obviously, between our Windows 10 and our domain controller. And we can just double check that by coming up to the command prompt. Let's just do a quick ping of our domain controller, DC01, and we can use its DNS name, and we get a reply from our domain controller. That's great. Okay, now let's come down and go to start, go to our profile, and let's just log out. Let's try our second user. Come down here to other user, who is J. Hendricks. We will log in. And now we are creating his profile. Okay, now that both users can log in, let's just log back out of J. Hendricks here, and let's start applying some policies, some different policies for Bob Dylan and some different policies for Jimi Hendrix. Group policy serves as Active Directory's centralized management framework for configuring and enforcing organizational policies across the domain. This is a powerful administrative tool that enables us to implement security and controls throughout the domain. It is here where you can push policies such as restricting users from installing software, set user password complexity, bookmarks, logon scripts, and so much more. It's quite powerful and applies mainly to organizational units. Settings can be changed or either user-based or computer-based configuration changes. Group policy objects are managed through the Group Policy Management Console, which can be accessed from domain controllers or administrative workstations with the RSAT tools installed. Every domain includes two foundational policies that establish baseline security in operational settings. There's the default domain policy and the default domain controllers policy. The default domain policy contains the critical security settings that include the default password policy, and we'll see how it all works together shortly. Now, a local group policy is going to apply to the specific computer that you're running. Any policies set here will not apply to any domain connected computers or users. You can check your own local group policy by clicking Start and searching Group Policy and clicking the Edit Group Policy button. But the domain group policy is launched on the domain controller, and it controls all domain connected computers and users. The policy set from a domain group policy will supersede any local group policies. For example, you set a background picture using a local group policy and set that same background picture for that same user or computer using a domain policy. The domain group policy will be the background that's applied. Group policy objects follow a specific order of precedence during processing, which determines how conflicting settings are resolved when multiple policies apply to the same user or computer. The group policy processing order follows the acronym LSDOU, and I wish there was a better way to say it. It sounds better as an acronym, so I'll just leave it as that. Local policies are processed first, followed by site-linked policies, then domain-linked policies, and finally, organizational unit policies. Within each level, if multiple GPOs are linked, they process in the order displayed in the Group Policy Management Console, and you'll see it in the window. It'll show, numbers 1 through however many GPOs that you have. The top of the list is going to have the lowest precedence, and the policy at the bottom is going to have the highest precedence. You may think it would be opposite. You can kind of think of it as a way where if there is a conflict, anything since the original one will be overwritten. So if something is in list number 5 and something later on conflicts with that, well, that GPO later on is going to overwrite what was done back on link number 5. Okay, let's get logged into our DC01 here using the administrator account. And we will go over real quick the difference, now that we have everything set up, the difference between permissions, access, and policies. So in terms of permissions and access, we can go into the File Explorer here, go into the C drive, let's right click, do New Folder, and let's just call this Temp. And just to kind of prove to ourselves that our permissions and access is working in terms of users and groups on our domain, let's right click Temp and go to Properties, and we'll do Sharing. Now let's make an attempt to share this folder, but we're not going to share it with everybody on the network. We're going to give certain permissions and access to this folder. So let's go down to Share, and right now you can see the people that already have access is the user and user group that I am logged in with. And what we want to do is come up here to the drop down and do Find People, and let's give the administrators group permissions to read, write, and execute on this folder. So that would be our, I just do AD and check names. Oh, nope, sorry, let's do admins. Oh, if I can spell. You know what I think it is? I think it is my lab admins, right? That's right. So my lab administrators, that is the group that we're going to give permissions to. And we're going to say read and write for this group and click share. And now we see that the folder is shared. We can click done. All right, so this gives permission, remember, and we can launch Active Directory here and see everybody within our MyLab administrators group is going to be able to access that folder. So the members are just Bob Dylan. So what we would expect is Bob Dylan to be able to log in and access this folder, but not our other user, Jimi Hendrix. So let's just prove that that is the case. And I'll come in here real quick and just make a quick file. That way we actually have something in here to show for it. Let's switch back over to Windows 10A. Let's get logged in with B. Dylan and see if we can access that folder. Okay, so let's come down here to the File Explorer, go to this PC, go into the C drive. Oh, well, that's right, we're not actually connected to it on our C drive. We have to connect to the domain controller, so come up to the little address bar here. We'll do a // We'll do DC01/TEMP and hit enter, and it granted us access to that folder, and we do see that we have a document in here, so that is fantastic. So we do have ability to read and write within that folder. However, if we log out of here and we sign in with our J. Hendrix user, I would expect if we did the same thing that we would not be able to access it. Come down here to the File Explorer. Down here, let's do the same thing. //DC01/TEMP. And we do not have permissions. And that is just a very basic example of setting permissions to network resources using groups, and that is a best practice. So if we switch back over to our domain controller, we can start going through group policy objects, and you can see the difference when we start applying policies to these Windows 10 virtual machines, and see how it's different from permissions and access. So launch group policy, and we can come down to start and just type group policy. And this will launch the group policy management console. Up here is our root forest. This is our domain folder, and this is our one domain that we have right now. And you can see in here it shows all of our organizational units, as well as the group policy objects folder, which actually has a couple default policies. This folder is going to house all of the group policy objects that either are by default or that you create. And basically what's going to happen is you're going to create links or shortcuts and apply those shortcuts to these OUs. So right now you can see that there is a default domain policy existing right here under group policy objects, and then you can see its shortcut kind of at the top of these OUs here. And basically, if it's outside of these OUs, sitting up here at the top, this is going to be the root-most level where you can apply policies. So basically, this policy, default domain policy, will apply in a hierarchical manner. So it is at the root of mylab.com, so it's going to apply itself to every OU underneath it. So what we can do right now, just to test some policies, is let's create a GPO in our admin's OU. So what we can do is select it, right click, and do create a GPO in this domain and link it here. Basically what that's going to do, we can just click on it and we will talk about it. Let's call it, nope, we're going to restart this whole thing. So come down here to start and launch group policy management. And here you can hit the drop downs and you'll see kind of your hierarchy of your top level forest, your domains folder, and then here is our one domain that we have, along with a list of our OUs and some other folders in here. And you'll notice one is called group policy objects down here. This is going to house all of our group policy objects that we make. And you can see that there are a couple defaults in here. And so any policy that is created is going to be listed in here. And basically what we do is we link it to apply to a particular OU. And you can see this default domain policy, this little shortcut icon is already linked. However, it's not linked to an OU. It's actually sitting above the OUs. And what that would mean is that it's actually the domain level group policy. So this would actually apply to everything below it. And we can create more on the domain level, but for right now, let's just create one on a particular OU. Let's create one. A very basic policy to apply would be restricting the command prompt from being accessed by a regular basic user and only allow administrators to access the command prompt. That's just a good security practice in general. So if we right click the user's OU, we can do a create a GPO in this domain and link it here. And we're going to call this command prompt restriction. And we'll say OK. Now that did two things for us. That created the group policy object here, which as I was saying, every group policy object is listed here. But it also created a link for us underneath this user's OU saying this is actually where that group policy is applied to. This is where it's applied to. So it's not applied to anywhere else right now, just the user's OU. So we can right click on the actual command prompt name here and go to edit. This is where we're going to actually apply our settings. Let's expand that out. And we're going to come down to user configuration because it is going to be on a per user basis. Come down to policies, administrative templates, and we are going to look in system. Now it should be pretty obvious under the system folder, about halfway down, we have a prevent access to the command prompt. Let's double click that. And right now it's not configured, so we are just going to enable it. And that is about as easy as it gets for configuring a particular policy. So we click apply and OK. And as you can see, the state has changed to enabled here. So that's all you really need to do to apply this particular policy is enable that. We are preventing access to the command prompt. So now you can exit up here on the right. And that brings you back to the group policy management. And so if we want to see what settings are applied under this name, we can go to settings. All right, under settings, you'll see everything that this GPO is doing. And for us, it's just that one policy. So under here, it says where it is located. If you expand this under system, you'll see prevent access to the command prompt. That is the policy that is applied. And you can check this for any other GPOs in your environment. For instance, the default domain policy, and under settings we can see we have some policies applied under security settings, and if we expand that out, we can see the password policy that exists when you create a user on the domain. You may have noticed if you typed in a password that did not meet the complexity or the length of the default domain policy, it rejected you. So you can see it here as to what the requirements are, and you can actually make changes to it if you want. So for us, this is all we wanted to test out. So all we have to do is go back to our Windows 10 here. Okay, let's log in with, right now this is only applied to the users OU, so we want to use our Jimi Hendrix user because he is listed under that OU. Now GPOs, even though that you can apply them automatically, they don't necessarily get pushed out in real time, so you might have to come down here to start and try to launch the command prompt. So we'll do CMD, launch it. Well, in our case, it did apply. As you can see here, the command prompt has been disabled by your administrator. So Jimi Hendrix as a user cannot access the command prompt. That's exactly what we want. So let's log back out and test this theory if we were going to try our Bob Dylan user. Come down here to other user, be Dylan, and log in. And if you've noticed, I do have a different background here. I've just been experimenting with some different GPOs in the meantime, so this was deliberate on my part. So if we come down to start and we launch the command prompt again, well, now we have access because Bob Dylan is not in the organizational unit that had that policy applied, which is great. So what we can do, let's exit out of this, let's go back to it. Let's do a CMD. Let's run it as administrator. Now, when we do this, it's going to ask for administrative privileges to say, hey, under whose authority can you actually request to run something as an admin? So even though we've put Bob Dylan in the admin's OU and given him a security group for an admin, we actually haven't given him permission to do any administrative privileges yet. So we will have to just use our administrator account because that one does have the correct groups associated with it to allow for administrative access. So now we are running as an admin, and I wanted to do that because I want to show you kind of the difference when we're talking about GPOs. When we log into a machine and we want to know what policies are applied to either the user or the computer of that machine, we can do a GP result space, and we can do a /user to specify what user we want to get the results from. So let's first start with our J Hendrix user, and we'll do a /R, hit enter, make this full screen here. So this is kind of our result tool, right? So it'll give us a lot of information, but really what we're looking for is we have a computer setting policy, which we didn't really set anything for the computer settings. So these are all still just applying the default domain policy. If we come down to user settings, that is where we applied our GPO, and you can see here applied group policy objects is the command prompt restriction. So if you see that, then you know that this computer and user has received the GPO information from the domain controller. So if we do the same thing and we do it for Bob Dylan, we press enter here, we can see his results. And again, nothing changed under the computer settings, but look at his user settings. NA for applied group policy objects. So nothing got applied to him, but yet under our Jimi Hendrix, we got the restriction applied. So that's what we want to see. If you were to do this and you were actually able to launch the command prompt under the Jimi Hendrix user, what you can do is run a gp update /force, and basically what that's going to do is it's going to go pull the group policy information from your domain controller and apply it to the machine. And it is successful here, so that would take place pretty much automatically, but you can also just give your machine a reboot as well if it didn't apply for you. One thing we had mentioned doing, which we haven't done yet, is assign our B Dylan user administrative role privileges on our domain. So let's get back logged into our domain controller, and let's just assign him, basically, let's give him the same privileges that the built-in administrator has. So back in our Active Directory users and computers under built-in, we have the administrators group here, and we have the administrator user. So this administrator user is part of domain admins, domain users, right? All of these options here. So we're gonna right click and do find. We'll find Dylan here. Okay, and we're gonna compare the two. We're going to compare Bob with this guy here. So let's get them side by side. So I am basically trying to give Bob full domain admin privileges here. So let's give him domain admins. Okay, let's give him enterprise admins as well. Let's give him group policy owners and creators, and schema admins. Pretty much all of the administrative level privileges that you can get. So now that he has that, back in our Windows 10 machine, let's get back logged in as Bob Dylan. And last time we were trying to run the command prompt as an admin, and Bob was unable to do it. But now we've given him permissions. So now Bob can just run as an admin without issue, because not only is he listed as a domain admin, but if we go to computer management, you also need to have local admin privileges on the box to run things as an administrator on the box. So under local admins and groups, under administrators, If you are part of the domain admins group, you are a local admin on a box whenever you log in. A domain trust is a relationship between two different domains that allows users in one domain to be authenticated by the other domain. It's a way to grant users in one domain access to resources in another domain without requiring them to have separate accounts in the second domain. Think of it as a digital handshake, allowing authentication information to flow between the domains. Types of trust. We have one-way, two-way, transitive, and non-transitive. A one-way trust is, say for example, domain A trusts domain B, but domain B does not trust domain A. That would be a one-way trust. A two-way trust is when you have domain A that trusts domain B and domain B trusts domain A. That is a two-way trust. A transitive trust is if domain A trusts domain B and domain B trusts domain C, then domain A will implicitly trust C because it will take domain B's word for it and trust domain C. A non-transitive trust is if domain A trusts domain B and domain B trusts domain C, but domain A does not take domain B's word for it, so it will not trust domain C. That is non-transitive. In most production environments, companies will likely have multiple domain controllers deployed within their Active Directory for redundancy purposes. If one domain controller fails, users can still authenticate to domain resources through the other domain controller. This solution is called replication. It gives us two abilities. One is to have redundancy by syncing data between the two controllers, and two is having a backup in case there is a hardware issue with the host that a domain controller lives on. In our lab, I'll show you how to deploy a second domain controller and configure replication. Just know that since we are in a lab, both domain controllers are going to be living on the same hardware, in my case, my PC. So if I had hardware issues with my PC, we would potentially lose data on both domain controllers. In production environments, we would separate domain controllers onto different hosts, using something like affinity rules, for example. So let's jump into the lab and set up a second controller for replication. Okay, so I've gone ahead and deployed a new Windows Server 2019 image like we did before. I gave it the name DC02. And I've set the static IP to 192.168.3.30. And I set the same default gateway and the same DNS settings as DC01, with DC01 being the DNS server. So go ahead and get this new server deployed before we proceed. So that's going to be, giving it that static IP address, setting the DNS, changing the computer name to DC02, and you're also going to want to join that computer to the domain prior to promoting this to a new domain controller. So if we jump back into DC01 here, and I launch Active Directory, you'll see that we pre-staged DC02 computer object here under domain controllers. So you want to make sure that you do that. So you just come down here, right click on domain controllers, new, and computer, and just make sure DC02 is in here with DC01 before you join the new server to the domain. Alright, so now we jump back in here, we go to DC02, this is our new server. We haven't done anything yet except for deploy it and give it those settings that we talked about and join it to the domain. It's basically just like any other server that you join to the domain right now. So what we want to do is we want to basically just make this a secondary domain controller. So we want to come up here and do the same thing we did for DC01. We want to come up to add roles and features. Okay, and since we've done this before, I'll go a little bit quicker. We're going to select next here, role-based installation, yes. DC02, that is the server that we're on. And we want to add Active Directory domain services with all of these sub roles, just like we did. Click next. And we're going to click next all the way through until we get to confirmation. The installation is not going to reboot the server, so we don't have to check this box here. So we can go ahead and just click install. Wait for that to install. Okay, should be fairly quick, and now we have the message saying additional steps are required to make this a domain controller, and that is fine. We can click the promote this server to a domain controller right here. So now we're at the spot where we were going to add a new forest, but this time, since we already have a forest and we already have an existing domain, all we want to do is add a domain controller to an existing domain. So we can select this first one right here, no problem. Come down to domain, and if it's already pre-filled, that's great. If not, the domain is mylab.com, and you can type it in right there. And now it says supply the credentials to perform this operation. Well, the current credentials are the administrator account on our local domain controller 02. And that's not really going to give us the authority to add a new domain controller, because this credential only exists on this machine. It can't really authorize us on the DC01 domain, right? DC01 domain is not going to know who this administrator is. It's not part of any accounts that are on the domain. It only exists here on DC02. So we're going to change this, and we're going to say who has domain admin privileges to be able to grant us this authority. Well, we only have one user with that privilege, and that is Mr. Bob Dylan here. So be Dylan, and then the password that you set for him, and click OK. All right, and now you can see that this credential is referencing the domain mylab. So that's who's going to give us the authority here. So click next. Okay, so if you made it this far, then we know the account is good. It can contact the DC01 domain controller, and we can move forward from here. So we want to make sure that global catalog is selected. It is recommended for most environments. And here we can decide if we want it to be a DNS server. So even if we didn't check it back there, we can check it here. And if we go down to the restore mode password, let's just, for our sake, let's just make a password. We're not going to really go over restore mode in this lab, but that should be fine. So let's click next here, and don't worry too much about this warning as long as we can get the option to select next. Let's go ahead and do that, and it's going to ask us where we want to replicate from. And we could just let it auto select, but I like to just specify that we do want it to be DC01. That's going to be our replication domain controller. So select next here. Now paths, we can keep the defaults, and if it doesn't exist, we can go ahead and create it so it exists. So if you click next and it doesn't get you past that point, it's happened to me before, just go ahead and create the NTDS and sysvol directories under Windows, and then you'll be able to get past this. window here. Select next. All right, let's review everything. We can click next here. It's going to go through its verification of all the prerequisites to enable replication between the two. And it looks like all checks have passed. And so let's go ahead and click install. Alright, so now that it is configured for replication and it has rebooted, let's make this full screen here. Let's go in and check it. Make sure that it is actually working. So we'll log back in. Alright, so we want to come down to start. And let's do a search for CMD. Okay, so we want to verify that the replication is working properly. All right, so we're going to use the command rep admin space / show repl, R-E-P-L, show replication. So press enter here. And let's make this full screen, come up here. All right, so we can see under inbound neighbors, right? So we can see our domain, okay? We can see our default first site is DC01, okay? So because we see this and we see all these attempts being successful, that is our first indicator that we have successful replication on our new domain controller. Now let's go back to DC01 and get logged into DC01. So let's check DNS here. Look under forward lookup zones, check out mylab.com. All right, we can see we have DC02 and DC01 both in the DNS record, right? And we can come back to DC02, launch DNS. Come down here, forward lookup zones, mylab.com, and look at that. We have some replication here because now we see DC01 and DC02 on both domain controllers. So we know we have DNS replication. That's great. Let's launch Active Directory users and computers. So we have the current domain controller DC02, and you can see it has the information that we created on DC01. We have the admins OU with Bob Dylan. We have the computers OU, domain controllers OU, servers OU, users OU. So we actually see the same information on DC02 that we see on DC01. That is exactly what we want. We have verified the replication is working through the command prompt. We verified it is working on DNS, and we verified it's working on the Active Directory users and computers. So that's great. Now we have to really test it and find out the reason why we have replication in the first place. So it would be for redundancy. So to test redundancy, the best thing to do would be to bring one of these domain controllers down and see if a user can still successfully log in and access domain resources if one of these domain controllers happens to be down. So let's go to DC01 here. All right, so I'm going to shut down DC01 and simulate an outage. So DC01 is shutting down. Let's go back to the home tab. Okay, I'll kind of wait for DC01 to turn itself off. Okay, great. So let's log into Win10A. All right, so power this machine on here. And now we're going to be a user and we're going to attempt to log on to the domain. And hopefully, if replication is working properly, DC02 will act as the primary domain controller since DC01 is offline. So let's get ourselves logged in, and I am going to use the Bob Dylan account. Log in here. So we were successfully able to log in. So you could just assume that everything's fine because we authenticated. So we used a domain controller to authenticate, obviously. We used the default authentication protocol Kerberos to allow us to log into domain. But how do we know for sure? How do we know that we are actually using DC02 as the domain controller and not just some kind of cached credential that is still using DC01? Well, let's check it out. Let's go to start, down to CMD, launch command prompt here. So we're going to type in echo space % logon server % and enter. That's going to tell us what logon server we are using. And for us, it is actually using DC02. So we have now verified that we're actually authenticating using DC02 even though DC01 is offline. If you have DC01 here instead of DC02, that's fine. It just meant that you have some kind of cached credential. And what you can do is either log off or reboot the machine and attempt to log on again. And when you do that, launch the same thing, and you should see DC02 as your primary domain controller. So this verifies for us and shows us how replication would work. And just remember, in a production environment, you'll have these domain controllers on separate hosts. So not only if like a VM goes down or a host goes down, you're not going to lose both domain controllers because they should be on separate hosts. So that kind of concludes the domain controller replication demo for today. So we want to understand the two built-in Active Directory security groups. One being the Domain Admins Group, which is a global security group that exists in every Active Directory domain. Members of this group have complete administrative control over their entire domain, so don't assign just any users to this group. And there's Enterprise Admins, which have even higher privileges, as this spans across the entire forest, which spans all domains in the forest. This is a built-in universal security group and should be reserved for somebody that is a lead IT engineer or architect in your company. So let's touch on physical security of domain controllers. You can think of the domain controller as the king of your home lab, right? It holds the keys to the kingdom, controlling access to every user in your domain. With domain admin privileges, you essentially have complete control over the Active Directory service. You can create users, manage groups, change policies, even accidentally or intentionally bring down your entire system. So because you have the power to do anything, you also have the power to cause serious problems. That's why security best practices dictate that we should be very careful of who we grant domain admin rights to. We need to limit the number of people who can log in to the domain controller in the first place. This follows the least privilege principle. giving users only the minimum access they need to perform their jobs. Using a dedicated service account for applications. You can think about how to run your server applications. Do you just fire them up under your own user account? Well, what happens when your password expires, or you leave the company, or the application no longer works? What about using somebody else's credentials? Well, as you can imagine, that would be a recipe for potential security problems also. So here's a better approach. Use dedicated service accounts. Service accounts are like custom-built user accounts dedicated to specifically run applications. Instead of using your own personal account, you create a separate account that just has permissions for that application. So why is this a good idea? Well, it increases security. You can grant that service account only permissions it needs to do that particular function. So you're still following the principle of least privilege. So if an attacker compromises that application, they only gain access to the resources that that service account has access to, limiting any potential damage. They don't get access to your personal files, your email, or other sensitive data. And it's just for better management. Security accounts make it easier to track and manage what application has what access. You know exactly what permissions the application has and can easily revoke or modify them if needed. And lastly, there's accountability. If something goes wrong with the application, you can easily trace it back to the service account and better understand what happened. And we have separation of DNS duties. You may have heard separation of duties as it relates to You may have heard of separation of duties as it relates to job functions. And for DNS, it's essentially the same thing. A common configuration involves creating separate DNS servers called authoritative and recursive. Authoritative DNS servers, these are the servers that hold the zone files and are authoritative for specific domains. For us, it's the internal lab domain. They directly answer queries or resources within their zone. Our domain controller hosting the DNS role acts as the authoritative server for mylabdomain.com. It only contains records pertinent to that internal domain and will not resolve external domain names, such as Google's domain name. Recursive DNS servers, when an authoritative server receives a query for a domain outside its authority, such as we just said, google.com or say www.udemy.com, it must forward the request to a recursive DNS server. These servers are typically located, in a DMZ or externally to your internal network, and are responsible for asking other DNS servers on the internet until the authoritative server for that request is found. So the recursive server, it will then retrieve the answer, cache it, and then return the results back internally to the internal user. I have found this level of separation in businesses and governments alike. It ensures that internal DNS servers are not burdened with resolving external queries, and that external resolution is handled externally, which potentially improves performance and security. In this course, the key concepts covered were understanding Active Directory, how we can deploy a lab environment at home using virtualization, administering an Active Directory environment, and basic best practices and security concepts. You have learned to build an Active Directory domain from scratch. You have learned the core components, including group policy, organizational units, user and group management, domain trusts, replication, and we touched a bit on some best practices in troubleshooting. In the next video, I will introduce more advanced Active Directory topics that we will learn, such as 802.1x authentication, Active Directory certificate services, hardening techniques, creating cybersecurity policies for Active Directory, backup and restore options for our VMs, and how to make things easier for us by automating using PowerShell scripting. I encourage anyone who is looking to further their IT skills to continue to stay motivated, stay adaptable, and stay relevant. Thank you to all the learners out there who have taken the time to go through my course. I look forward to seeing you in my other courses as well. If you like this video, please leave a review and share with the other learners, and I will see you next time.